Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our viewers from around the world to the fourth season of this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York, and you may ask questions using the box on the right-hand side of the screen. As a reminder, Polaris Live is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletters at kashmiri.com. My guest today, Mr. Ankit Panda, is a Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. An expert on the Asia-Pacific region, his research interests include nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear strategy, arms control, missile defense, and emerging technologies. He has consulted for the United Nations in New York and Geneva and has testified on security topics before the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. Mr. Panda's work has appeared in leading publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. He's the author of the best-selling book, Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. And by the way, you may buy it using the link on my website, kashmiri.com. Welcome to Polaris Live, Ankit Panda. Real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Sarwar. It's great to be here. It's great to be here on the show.
With your deep understanding of the impact of nuclear weapons on geopolitics, do you believe that China and the United States are destined for war?
Yeah, so, the problem of what drives states to war continues to be debated among international relations scholars. There really is no consensus. I think we understand historically some of the circumstances that could lead to conflict between major powers. But, you referred to the role of nuclear weapons. One of the things that nuclear weapons do in international politics that I think is fairly unambiguous, and I think we observe in the course of the Russia-Ukraine war, is that they fundamentally do dissuade major powers from engaging in direct armed conflict with each other. And so in this sense, they should actually weigh against the United States and China entering into a major conflict. But of course, you and I know that this unfortunately isn't the reality given the growing tensions between the two countries, the wide range of geopolitical disagreements, China's perception that the United States is fundamentally unwilling to respect certain of its so-called core interests, including the status of Taiwan in particular.
Right.
And so while I'm not willing to go as far as to say that the two countries are predestined to conflict, I do worry, of course, that a conflict may be on the table, particularly as a result of China feeling the necessity to take deliberate action, or even as a result of the United States potentially changing its policy on Taiwan or encouraging Taiwanese independence in the future. And so we have to be vigilant to these kinds of dynamics. And then you asked, the role of nuclear weapons in such a conflict are, I think, inseparable from U.S.-China military dynamics. There was a period when in Washington, D.C., where I live, a lot of simulations and war games thinking through a U.S.-China conflict scenario would set aside the role of nuclear weapons because either they were seen as irrelevant or too complex to bring into these kinds of scenarios. But they will be absolutely central. These are two nuclear armed powers. And so ultimately, as the United States and the Soviet Union learned during the Cold War, I think the U.S. and China will have to give thought to strategic stability, arms control, and taking steps that can ensure that despite their systemic competition, they don't end up in a nuclear conflict involving the other.
But there is another dimension to this, and that is the perception by either side that they are in a weaker position. And I bring this up because you referred to war games, computer war games in the U.S. military, and I'm somewhat familiar with them. And in most of them, the United States does not prevail in a war in the Indo-Pacific. And I think back to the days right after the Second World War, when America became responsible for Europe's defense. When the Soviet Union has a vastly larger army numerically And there was real concern that America just didn't have the strength to field a force to equal that. And so America decided to include nuclear weapons on European soil and made it known that America would use them. So that's another concern, isn't it, of using these nuclear weapons between China and America?
It is, yeah. So, what you're referring to was essentially the offset strategy, where out of concern of conventional inferiority, i.e., inferiority with all military capabilities apart from nuclear weapons, the United States essentially saw nuclear weapons as a cost-effective way to communicate to the Soviet Union that it could disproportionately have significant military effects outside of the conventional forces that it deployed. And this is absolutely relevant today in the U.S.-China context. I participate quite a bit in dialogues with Chinese counterparts and experts on these questions surrounding the role that nuclear weapons might play in a U.S.-China crisis or conflict. And one of the concerns that many Chinese experts have is that they fear that this kind of thinking may be returning to the United States, partly because um, the U.S. is, I think, concerned about what I describe as local conventional inferiority in the Indo-Pacific in particular, which means that China, of course, is present in the Indo-Pacific geographically. Its military forces operate there. The entirety of its military forces are largely present on its borders, in its near seas, in its airspace that is contiguous to the Chinese mainland, whereas the United States has to project power across the vast expanse of the Pacific, and as a global military power in its own right, the U.S. can't concentrate its military forces in the Indo-Pacific to deter or fight a conflict with China. And so, as a result of this, Chinese experts are, I think, concerned that the U.S. might be seeking capabilities whereby it would have additional options to potentially resort to the first use of nuclear weapons to seek military advantage in a crisis. This isn't formally part of the United States plans. This is not something that, for instance, the Biden administration talks about in the nuclear posture review. The U.S. maintains a policy of calculated ambiguity. But these are precisely the kinds of questions that, in my view, U.S. and Chinese officials need to be able to discuss in a candid and frank setting,
Mm,
in
mm.
a strategic stability consultation. That doesn't have to lead to any kind of arms control arrangement, which China does have concerns about. And maybe we can talk a little bit about why they have those concerns. But I think there is a need for the two countries to think about stabilizing their relationship that will
Right.
ensure that nuclear weapons play a minimal role in a future crisis or conflict.
Ankit Panda, one issue that I wish you would clarify. A lot of people like me who are not experts in this area as you are say, how can one even think about the use of nuclear weapons if that should happen? Uh, the world as we know it, civilization, will probably cease to exist anyway. So, is this really true that if we, I mean, is this a reality that if there is a nuclear war, that the world gets destroyed anyway? So, why should we worry? What do you
Yeah,
think? How do you answer such a question?
absolutely. I think you're getting at something really important, right? Which is that all nuclear armed states, the nine countries that possess nuclear weapons, rely on nuclear deterrence to serve their national security objectives. The threat of punishment by nuclear war is a powerful deterrent to an adversary from taking serious action against one's interests, right? But there's also the question of what exactly do nuclear weapons deter and what do they fail to deter? And so nuclear weapons, I think, are very good for the United States in deterring large scale nuclear or conventional attack on the U.S. homeland. Russia, China, North Korea understand that if they fired at the United States has a highly survivable nuclear force that could then retaliate. And so there is no advantage to taking that kind of action. This is the condition, essentially, of mutually assured destruction or mutual vulnerability that I think a lot of lay folks are familiar with. That when that condition obtains, you do actually have a degree of stability because both sides are vulnerable to the other's retaliation. And so this actually prevents the resort to nuclear weapons. They are not simply another tool or another weapon in the warfighting toolkit in the way that conventional weapons are, because those are seen as significantly less escalatory. But the risk is absolutely central to making deterrence work, right? There has to be some risk that everything spirals out of control, or that the two in a deterrence relationship, be it China and the U.S., Russia and the U.S., by continuing to take risks in a serious crisis, bring each other closer to the brink. And I think this has been really a part of how Russia has thought about implementing nuclear signaling and nuclear threat making in the course of its invasion of Ukraine. But then the other question you asked about, how can we even talk about this? I think this is, of course, something that in the world of nuclear strategy, it's very easy to talk about these horrifying situations that are catastrophic for humanity with fairly antiseptic language. But you're right. I mean, any use of nuclear weapons would represent a world historical event. Nuclear weapons have not been used since August 9th, 1945 in conflict. And fundamentally, the use of those weapons would represent, depending on your perspective, either an end to the taboo that exists around the use of nuclear weapons at war, potentially opening Pandora's box on these weapons potentially being viewed by military establishments around the world as a lot more usable of a capability, which of course has follow-on effects in conflicts in other parts of the world as well. Or alternatively, they simply end the tradition of non-use, which has been in place since August 9th. And those are related but distinct concepts, and that the taboo, I think, hints at this idea that nuclear weapons are uniquely repulsive weapons and that they should never be used for that reason, whereas the tradition of non-use simply describes the observed phenomenon in international politics, which is that despite the fact that these weapons have now existed for almost 8 decades, they continue to be unused in war, largely because I think there is fundamental uncertainty about what happens after a single nuclear weapon goes off. And I think I'll stop with this. What happens after a single nuclear weapon goes off? There's two schools of thought in how controllable nuclear escalation is. I would argue that parts of the establishment, military establishment in the United States and in other countries who operate and manage nuclear operations may have a greater belief that escalation can be controlled and that a nuclear war can be controlled to the extent that a single nuclear weapon being detonated does not necessarily mean automatic escalation to a world-ending exchange. I find myself on the other side of that argument, which is that I am far less confident in the ability of states to control escalation in the way that they think is possible. And so that suggests to me that any use of a nuclear weapon is very likely to lead to significantly greater nuclear use. And so that is why I think the use of any nuclear weapons needs to be prevented. And the role of nuclear weapons needs to be as low as possible in the national defense strategies of countries. Unfortunately, we are at a period now where China and other countries are increasing the role of nuclear weapons in their national security strategies for the first time in 3 decades. We see this around the world.
But Ankit, I find myself thinking, and tell me if you agree, disagree, that nuclear weapons can also add to stability of regions. And I'm thinking here specifically, switching regions now to the India-Pakistan area. They've had some deadly wars against one another. But since both developed nuclear weapons, there's not been a major war between the two. So can the possession of nuclear weapons add to stability in a region?
Absolutely. So I think the South Asian case is a really interesting one. India and Pakistan test nuclear weapons in 1998. They actually do fight a war in 1999, a fairly major conflict, not quite as major as the wars they fought in 1971 and 1965 and
Right.
1947 in severity. But it still did demonstrate that despite nuclear deterrence obtaining, that the possibility for crises was still there. But I think today, more than 25 years into the nuclear age between India and Pakistan, I would agree that we observe a high level of strategic stability where the idea of conventional conflict between the two sides is, I think, handled with far greater care. Although I will also say that the February 2019 skirmish between India and Pakistan over a terrorist attack carried out by a Pakistan-based group on Indian soil resulted in a fairly serious conflict that could have spiraled and escalated.
Right.
But I think we're getting at an important idea here, which is what scholars call the stability and stability paradox, which is this idea that when you have a high level of strategic stability or stability at the nuclear level, and this can be between India and Pakistan, it can be between the U.S. and China, it can be between North Korea and South Korea, that when you have some level of stability, when both sides understand that a resort to a high-intensity conflict, conventional or nuclear, is unlikely to bring advantage, that can actually perversely create a perception that there is actually greater room for subconventional or conventional violence below far below the threshold of an all-out war. And that is because both sides will understand that even if that violence does initiate, they will each have an incentive to keep it bounded. And this is arguably what I think India and Pakistan have struggled with since 1998, which has been for India primarily the problem of death by 1,000 cuts through repeated
Yes.
attacks on its soil from Pakistan-based entities. And this is actually something where nuclear weapons don't do a very good job of deterring that, right? And so the role of nuclear weapons, again, is, I think, important to understand in what nuclear weapons do and do not do. I do think ultimately they have a cautioning effect on world leaders, and so nuclear deterrence absolutely does work in promoting stability and preventing major war, but it also does have these perverse consequences in limiting the room for maneuver. For instance, India, for instance, after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which were a major attack on Indian soil on a major Indian city, resulting in deaths of 180 plus civilians, India was ultimately unable to react with conventional military power or really impose kinetic costs on Pakistan, because ultimately the role of nuclear weapons hangs over the two countries, which has, I think, limiting effects on both.
Yeah. And what if I was to widen this optic into an area that I haven't seen explored previously, to the Middle East? At this point, we have one country that has nuclear weapons, Israel. What if there was another country that developed nuclear weapons? Do you think the Middle East would be more stable in the same line of thinking that we've just been exploring?
Well, so, the Israeli nuclear capability, formally as a matter of policy, Israel maintains a position of opacity, which is that
Of
the whole
course.
world knows that they have nuclear weapons, but
Yes.
they don't talk about it. They don't signal with nuclear weapons. They don't make nuclear threats. There was some role for Israeli nuclear weapons in the 1973 war, but since then, the Israelis have never really seen a crisis rising to the level where nuclear use might be necessary. But Iran, of course, is the next closest state to acquiring a nuclear weapons capability today. They have massive amounts of highly enriched uranium that they're now sitting on. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which sought to constrain their ability to produce nuclear fuel, is largely in tatters today. And so if Iran did acquire nuclear weapons, and the only two countries in the Middle East that existed were Israel and Iran, then sure, we can maybe accept that there would be a version of some kind of stability that might obtain. But of course, that is not the reality, right? And the problem with the Middle East and the problem with Iranian proliferation is that it is quite likely that it would lead to follow-on nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. And so here, countries like Saudi Arabia, in
Mm.
particular, to a lesser extent, Turkey, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, all countries with either political leaders who've professed an interest in nuclear weapons, a degree of nuclear technological capability, or resources simply to seek nuclear weapons, would, I think, pursue a similar capability. And so one of the reasons why, at least in the United States, the spread of nuclear weapons has just been seen as not necessarily a lever of national policy that we want to rely on, is because a proliferated world is a more complicated world. You have more fingers on the button, more chances that nuclear war can begin, can escalate, and so we continue to have an enduring interest in, I think, preventing that kind of proliferation in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Two questions have that I'd like to pick up on that viewers are asking. The first one is that what would be America's stand if India does nuclear testing in the medium term, and because it has not signed the agreement, the CTBT. And what are you thinking about that? And the second part of the question is, will America place nuclear weapons in Taiwan to counterbalance China? What are your thoughts? I pose them both to you, Ankit.
Sure. So the first question on Indian nuclear testing. So U.S.-India nuclear cooperation and convergence is predicated on India's nuclear testing moratorium. And so any nuclear testing in India would actually automatically result in sanctions on India from the United
Mm,
States,
mm,
condemnation from other countries around the world. It
mm.
would result in India losing the waiver it gained from the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2008. So it would have sort of severe economic consequences on India's nuclear energy sector. It would also likely, in my opinion, not significantly enhance India's deterrence capabilities. The main reason I think some in India have called to resume nuclear testing is actually due to the fairly well-known fact that one of India's nuclear test devices in 1998, a higher yield thermonuclear device, actually did fizzle. It did not operate as intended with its design. And so there is now, I think, a push in parts of India to rectify that, partly as there are growing concerns about China's expansion of nuclear capability and the need for India to convey to Beijing that its criteria and its nuclear doctrine for unacceptable damage, India's criteria, can still be met with Indian nuclear weapons. But ultimately, my view is that the cost benefit here does not really shake out in India's favor. This is a broader issue, which is that are we looking at a world where more nuclear states will have an impulse to test? There was some concern that Russia might go back to testing after Vladimir Putin suspended Russia's participation in the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty as well. And so we are, I think, potentially heading into that space. But again, I think states have to calculate that there is no scenario in which one state tests and everybody else stands still. And so again, testing anywhere, in my opinion, is likely to lead to testing everywhere. And the U.S. in particular, I think, has a very strong interest in not seeing that because just as a historical coincidence, the United States has the most test data from its nuclear testing. The U.S. did more nuclear tests than the Soviet Union and other countries. And so if other countries are able to test again, the U.S. comparative advantage is likely to wane. And so there is an interest in preventing a return to a world in nuclear testing. The second question about nuclear weapons on Taiwan. Look, I mean, the U.S. and Taiwan don't have a mutual defense treaty anymore. U.S. policy towards Taiwan is to support Taiwan with its own national self-defense, but not to promote Taiwanese independence or to overtly deploy U.S. military capabilities to Taiwan. And so this idea, which does come up occasionally, is one of those scenarios that I kind of hinted at the beginning of our call, which is actions that the United States could take that would actually increase the risk of war between the U.S. and China. And so this would not be something, just by the nature of the U.S. system today, as a democracy with a free press, this would be something that would be very unlikely to remain a secret. There would be open debates, and that would likely, I think, create the conditions in China where China would potentially feel compelled to take military action before any American significant military support could arrive on Taiwan. And the other fact, I mean, this is a pretty technical point, but compared to the Cold War, the kinds of non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons the United States possesses today are just very different kinds of weapons. They require specific storage infrastructure, handling mechanisms. So this is more than a few transport aircraft flying to Taiwan with nuclear weapons on board. There would have to be a comprehensive and systemic effort. So it's just not a realistic proposal. And frankly, I think the Taiwanese would also oppose the idea, given their interest in deterring war and maintaining the status quo under the current government as well.
So let me take a moment, please, to remind viewers that PolarisLive.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletters by going to kashmiri.com. There's no cost, but it really does help for us to increase our subscriber list. What I'd like to now do is ask you, Ankit, that the South China Morning Post reports today that law enforcement authorities in China and the United States increasingly coordinate their law enforcement functions, right? Both are collaborating, it seems, increasingly on artificial intelligence and environmental issues. Are there areas in the subject we've been talking about, nuclear weaponry and so on, that you think the two can work together?
Yeah, so the U.S. National labs, for instance, have had long-standing technical collaboration and cooperation efforts on kind of scientific and technical issues with their Chinese counterparts, which is good. It builds relationships across the two countries, technical communities, builds mutual understanding. And there continues to be a lot of space, I think, for the two countries to collaborate there. That said, There is, I think, increasing skepticism in the United States. Congress, for instance, is trying to include language in the new National Defense Authorization Act that would limit Chinese and Russian citizens from being able to enter any U.S. national labs, which the Biden administration has actually opposed because they see it making this kind of cooperation more difficult. And there aren't really information security concerns there because anybody visiting those labs is already vetted quite carefully, and they're confined to specific areas and not given unfettered access, for instance, to restricted data or other classified information. Similarly, I think in the area of climate change, there's technical capacity for cooperation on space issues as well. I think the overarching problem, though, is sort of what I alluded to with the geopolitical tensions between the two countries. Ultimately, promoting this kind of cooperation needs constituencies in both the United States and China that view this as supporting their national interests and goals. And in the United States, this is not the majority view, I would say. I think there is greater skepticism about promoting cooperation out of fears that might lead to intelligence collection efforts that could harm U.S. national security. But I think one of the lessons we learned from the Cold War is that systemic competition between two nuclear armed states can take place under the nuclear overhang, but it does require efforts to actively stabilize things. And so here, the U.S. has been trying to promote arms control as a tool to stabilize the U.S.-China relationship. Unfortunately, Beijing has not reciprocated that interest. And so that does lead to a place now where calls for arms control are really one-sided. China has certain good strategic reasons to not want to engage in arms control, largely out of, I think, perceptions that arms control is a transparency enhancing tool that could actually harm China's national security interests because of China's at least China's own self-perception that its military and nuclear capabilities are a lot more limited and inferior to those of the United States. So I think this is a process that will take a certain degree of time. China is in the process of building up its nuclear arsenal, as I suggested earlier. And so it's quite possible that when that process is complete, China will have a different perspective on arms control and strategic stability.
So, Ankit Pandya, we're starting to run out of time, but I do have a final question to ask you, and that is, you wrote this really interesting book called Kim Jong-un and the Bomb: Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. I'd just like to know what drove you to write this, and what did you hope to get out of it? What were some of your conclusions? We have 2 or 3 minutes before we'll need to wrap up, but I do want to give people a chance to hear about your book. And as we know, our producer's given us a link to buy the book. So talk a little bit about the book, Ankit.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So the book was really an effort to amalgamate a lot of the writing and analysis that I'd been doing on North Korea. It is the first comprehensive effort to compile resources on North Korea's nuclear strategy, nuclear capabilities, and the broader diplomatic and geopolitical context on the Korean Peninsula and how it affects everything from nuclear deterrence to the ability of the United States to manage its alliances in Northeast Asia. And so that's what the book does. One of the core arguments that the book also makes is that North Korea is no longer a nonproliferation problem, that this was a country that once the United States viewed as a potential pursuer of nuclear weapons, that potential has been fully realized. They have a robust nuclear capability. They are an increasingly capable actor. Since I wrote the book, there have been a lot more concerning developments, some of which were actually I anticipated in the book, which I was happy to see. Well, not happy in the sense that the North Koreans did it, but happy in the sense that the predictions were somewhat accurate. But it is I think still quite relevant. I think it emphasizes that one of the features of this new nuclear era that we're entering in the coming decades is going to involve a more active space and role for these new nuclear countries and actors like North Korea, who are a lot more capable. Russia's embrace of North Korea, I think, is going to be the next one of the next big foreign policy issues for the United States, and so that's something I'm tracking quite closely now.
Well, with that, and I wish we had more time, but we are running out of time, Ankit. So I want to thank you, really thank you for taking the time to join us on Polaris Live. I hope you'll come back and see us again.
Thanks for having me, Sarwar. Really enjoyed the show.
Thank you also to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for our next program. Polaris Live continues to explore the most consequential relationship in the world between the United States and China and its impact on the wider world. Until then, goodbye.